One of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible is the 12th chapter of Romans. I remember when I was a little kid, the man who preached in our home congregation, he said, if you want a rainy day sermon, or a sermon that you don't have very much time to prepare, choose something in the 12th chapter of Romans. And that was his love for it. I didn't really know anything about the 12th chapter of Romans at that time because I was just a little boy. But since then, I've come to really love this chapter. And I do have to alter his statement just a little bit about this whole idea of preparation. I did prepare. Okay. When I was preparing this sermon on things which make for peace, I couldn't help but think of the turmoil in the world today. I go way back yonder, you know. I can remember Second World War. I was in the Second World War, and I can remember the things that led up to it and various things like this. I remember a lot about Hitler coming into power and some of the things that Hitler did. And as I was preparing this sermon, I thought to myself, you know, the Bible doesn't say very much about political peace between nations and things like that. Or when you look in the Old Testament, you find a great deal of that, but not on the basis of nations negotiating with each other and the give and take of these things. But I thought to myself, you know, God deals with us as human beings individually. He doesn't deal with the nation as a whole, except in very general, broad language. So what's the lesson for us in this? Well, I think the lesson is this, that nations will not find peace among themselves or internationally until people find peace with God. For example, let's just imagine something for a moment. If the world, well, let's just say the United States and Europe, the what we call the Western world. If the Western world were all Christian, I mean by Christian, I don't mean, you know, with your name on a church robe somewhere. I mean if we were genuinely Christian. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Everyone loved one another. Everyone was practicing kindness and compassion for one another. What kind of a Western world would we have? It wouldn't be a Western world that was concentrating on implements of destruction or anything like this at all. It would be a Western world at peace. Now, if you include the entire world in that scenario, can't you see that instead of negotiating over our armaments and over our right to take another portion of another country like we just seen done, instead there would be the kindness of one nation to another, the kindness of one person to another. And so, I got to thinking about this, and so I went back and just did a little research on dates. I remembered the events, but I didn't remember the exact dates. And so here it was. Between 1937 and 1939, Hitler invaded the Sudetenland. He invaded Czechoslovakia, which was a part of that. He invaded other of the neighboring nations in that part of Europe, and then he invaded Austria and Hungary. Now, I'm not trying to make a political thing out of this at all, but I'm saying that was the war to end all wars. By the way, the First World War was the war to end all wars, wasn't it? Well, I remember when these things were taking place in September of 1938, Neville Chamberlain made a very famous trip to Munich, Germany, to talk with the Germans to try and establish some kind of peace. What's going on, Hitler? What are you trying to do? What are you going to do? I've got all that I want. And they signed a peace accord. And I remember seeing in the newspaper Neville Chamberlain came back and it showed him in a cartoon, a political cartoon, you know. It showed him holding this piece of cord that had been signed, and then on top of that was a dove. And you know what the caption was? Peace in our time. That was in September of 1938. In September of 1939, what happened? Hitler invaded Germany, and the Second World War began. Well, like I said, I went back and I took a look at dates and things like this about this whole thing. Why do things like this happen? In our country, Christianity is ridiculed a whole lot. It's literally open season on Christianity. You can't say anything about Islam or Hinduism or Shintoism or something like that. You can't say anything about that, but you can say anything you want to about Christianity. And people do that very thing. A statement that Bill Maher made the other day was just very disgusting about God being a mass murderer and things like this. And that was his expression. But here's the thing. We are looking for peace. Everybody wants peace. Everybody wants to live in a world of tranquility. Everybody wants to live in a world in which you and I are at peace with ourselves and at peace with God. And so the question comes up about how seriously do we in the church, or how seriously do we as Americans take this whole thing of Christianity? Or do we just kind of blend into the background, blend into the scenery of our culture and all? I read from Jeremiah this statement. Jeremiah was two men in the Old Testament were very human. Jeremiah is one, and Elijah is another. They had a lot in common. They didn't live at the same time, but they had a lot in common. Jeremiah was he was so upset over Judah and the terrible things that were happening in Judah, and Elijah was the same way about Israel sometime earlier. Well, here's what it said, Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. They dressed, that is the people of Judah, they dressed the wound of my people as though it were not serious. He's talking about their idolatry, their immorality. He's talking about how terrible the ethical and moral standards of his own country were. And he says they dressed the wound, but they treat it like it was really not serious. They say peace, peace, but there is no peace. And here's the clincher. Are they ashamed of their loathsome conduct? And the answer is really no. America is not ashamed of its loathsome conduct either. No, their shame has all gone. They do not even know how to blush. I had a teacher at David Lipscomb, and he was talking not about this passage, but he was talking about simply being embarrassed. Being embarrassed. Nothing is embarrassing anymore, is it? What you see on TV is so horrible and terrible sometimes, but nobody's embarrassed over it. We're so used to it, we're calloused in reference to these things. And so this teacher, Harris Dark, he said, you know, you really lose something when you lose the power to blush. I just thought that was a good thing. Losing the power to blush. Where when you blush, the blood vessels in your head, particularly in your face, they expand rapidly, and blood flows to your face, and your face turns red, you know. Well, he says, you don't even blush, Jeremiah says. So they will fall among the fallen. They will be brought down, they would be punished, says the Lord. Consequences. They had to pay for it. Now, what does that have to do with our lesson? That's a rather long introduction to a lesson on peace, settling our problems peacefully. I'm not talking about national, international problems. I'm not talking about political problems, military problems, business problems. I'm talking about personal things. But I want us to see how the world deals with the idea of peace, and they ignore the real source of peace. Well, Jeremiah saw what the real problem was. There's not going to be any peace until men turn their hearts to God. A long time ago, there was a little tract that was written by a woman, and it was simply titled, "A Better World Begins with Me." And the tract was just kind of a brief story, really about herself. She had thought in terms of our world is very mixed up. Our world is tragically mixed up. And she said, how do I help change the world? And she thought through so many programs and so many things that are being done and were being done and so many things that were needed. And she came to the conclusion that the whole thing finally comes down to the individual. I've got to be a better person. I've got to do what God wants me to do. I've got to get my eyes off of the big picture and start looking at the little picture, which is me. A better world begins with me. Jeremiah said basically the same thing. He said, if you don't come back to God, there's going to be a price to pay. He said, no, there is no peace because you've forgotten about the Prince of Peace. Of course, Christ hadn't come at that time, and the expression Prince of Peace was not used in reference to him at that time. But the whole thing comes down to this fact that I have to come back to God. For the world to be a better world, for the community to be a better community, for my business to be a better business, for my family to be a better family, I have to come back to this idea of how do we settle our disputes? Peaceful, peaceful, peaceful settlement of our differences. Well, if you go all the way back to Noah, and you look at Noah, then you look at Joshua, and you look at Christ and the apostles, have you ever thought about the fact that the majority is usually wrong? The majority is usually wrong. Well, I'm not saying we ought to rearrange our political and things about majority rule and all. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about the fact that all through history, the majority, not politically, but ethically, morally, religiously, the majority has been wrong. And so, where does that leave me? Well, it leaves me in a situation where I have to sit down and really be personal with this whole thing. I just want to read a few passages to you, and I want us to think about some of the things that Paul says. For me to find peace with God, peace with each other, peace within myself, Paul gives us some really interesting and very informative information. Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. Paul says to the Colossians, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your sensual nature, sexual immorality. Well, now stop and think about that for a moment. Why, not only is sexual immorality allowed, it's celebrated, for goodness sakes. You turn on the TV and it's celebrated. And people living together without being married, it's celebrated. And what wonderful freedom we have. We're free to disobey God on everything God has said if we want to. But he says, put to death, therefore, sexual immorality, impurity, and lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Now, the American Standard, the King James Version, say covetousness. The literal meaning of the Greek word for covet is to be greedy. It's a very strong word, but it basically means to be greedy, selfish, everything for me. And he says that's idolatry. Why is that idolatry? Because greed causes us to worship that which we're greedy about. Now just stop and think of the things that could be cleaned up in our own culture and how it would change the orientation of our own culture if we got rid of this desire for wealth, the desire for money. People will do all kinds of things for money. Now, there's not anything wrong with money. There's certainly nothing wrong with ambition or anything like that. But it doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring tranquility to one's life. I read a statement a long time ago where a very famous man, as a matter of fact, he was a ruler of in the 18th century. He was a ruler of one of the European countries, and he said, I have counted the days in my life in which I was happy. He says it came to 14 days. Okay. What's the trouble? The emphasis is in the wrong place. Paul says, get rid of some of this stuff, folks. Get it out of your life. If you want your life to be a tranquil and peaceful life, these are some things that we need to get rid of. And so impurity and lust and desire and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming. Oh, Jeremiah, let me see. No, Paul. Isn't that the same thing Jeremiah said over and over and over? You're putting a patch on a cancerous sore. And you're acting like it's not very serious. And you say, oh, peace, peace, and there is no peace. And he says, you've lost your shame. That's exactly what Paul is talking about. They had finally to pay for what they had done. And that's the Babylonian captivity, isn't it? Now you must rid yourself of these things. And then he lists a few others there. Anger and rage and malice and slander and filthy language from your lips. Don't lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self and its practices, and you put on your new self. Now, those things are so practical. I'm arrested, though, with the question of how do I get rid of this stuff, folks? How do I get rid of it? Well, on your car, you've got forward, neutral, and reverse. Okay? We're in reverse now. Okay? We're in reverse. Let's don't be content to go into neutral. Neutral, you can press the gas pedal as hard as you want to. If you're in neutral, you ain't going nowhere. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And so, but we're living at a time when neutral is really the thing people are looking for. You see, I don't tell anybody what's wrong. They don't tell me what's wrong. Whatever is okay for them is okay for them. What's okay for me is okay for me. And so that way we're in neutral. We're not condemning the other person. We're not condemning wrong. Oh, no, you don't want to step on somebody. That's his business. That's his lifestyle. That's his way of living. He has the right to live that way. And so we're running in neutral. We need to push that thing forward. And we need to go ahead and present the world with the gospel. And that's a part of this whole thing of peace. So Paul says, put these things to death that I just read to you. Put these things to death. Kill them. How do I do that? Well, one way that I do that is by beginning to practice some things that are good. It isn't enough to quit your meanness. I've got to start doing something that replaces it. Instead of beating up on people, I just stop beating up on them. How can I help them? That's the whole idea. So Paul says, put to death these things. He kept on writing. That was chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. Now when he gets down to verse 12 of the same chapter, he says, therefore, you know my thing, when you see the word therefore, what? Find out what it's there for. Okay? That's the thing to do. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself. I really like that expression. Clothe yourself. Cover your body. Cover yourself with this. Compassion. Kindness. Humility. Gentleness. Patience. Them's good, folks. Them's is good. Yeah, just stop and think again. What would the world be like if everybody in the world was really genuinely trying to be compassionate and kind and humble and gentle and patient? An interesting thing to me. This was written to the Colossian church. In paganism, and especially in the Greek and Roman empires, the thought of the culture of the day through a number of centuries there was, these are not good qualities. Just not at all. No, you're not supposed to be compassionate. You're supposed to take up for yourself. Kindness, that's a weak portion of someone. Humility, really bad. Really bad. You're supposed to be very proud and arrogant, aggressive. And this was a part of the culture. Gentleness and patience. No, these were not qualities of paganism. And so Paul was writing this to a group of people to whom this was very strange. Very strange. And then he says, bear with each other and forgive each other. Like I mentioned this in the Bible class this morning. What is it to bear with each other? Forbear one another in love, Paul says. What is it to forbear? I heard a preacher when I was a student at Lipscomb. I heard a preacher on a meeting talking about this, and he says, this just simply means, look, I've got to put up with you, and you got to put up with me. And I don't like it any better than you do, but that's just the way things are. Well, I think he had something there. Do I like everybody? No, I don't like everybody. You don't either. There are people and so forth that I really don't like. It has nothing to do with loving your enemies. That's an entirely different thing. And the word is not how I feel toward someone. It's just not that at all. But Paul is saying that even if we don't like the person, we've got to learn to live in friendly, peaceful relationships with that person. How do you do that? You do it by practicing humility and kindness and gentleness and patience. Then we learn to forbear one another in love. Then we instead of criticizing and tearing down, we're trying to find something to build up in another person. Oh, I heard a story when I was very young. There was this terrible, terrible man in a little town, and nobody could think of anything at all that was good about him. He was evil from the ground up. But there was a lady there in that little town. She never criticized anybody. And she was known to be that kind of person. She didn't gossip. She didn't criticize. And so they went to her with kind of a test. And they called this man's name and said, "What do you think about him? Tell me something good about him." They thought they had her. And her answer was very simple. She said, "He sure can whistle." He sure can whistle. Christ didn't die for us because we were so good. He died for us because we were so bad. He goes on. He says, bear with each other. And then he says, forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. Forgive. That's difficult to do sometime, isn't it? And then he says, over all of these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since you're members of one body and you're called to peace. And be thankful. I think hooking all that last statement to this general thing here, he says, be thankful. I honestly believe that one of the greatest attributes that we can practice is the attribute of learning to be grateful. Just learning to be a grateful person. It's so easy to complain. It's so easy to gripe and grumble. It's so easy to be unthankful. It's so easy to see what other people have that I don't have, what other people have that I would like to have. And so I develop a negative attitude. I develop an attitude of ingratitude. And so peace comes to us when we learn to be grateful people. And I don't mean just expressing well, thank you very much. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about through our whole emotional, spiritual selves. Learn to be grateful people. Paul went through a horrible, horrible experience. He persecuted the church. He consented to the death of Stephen, you remember, the stoning of Stephen and all. And he just went through all of these terrible, terrible things. And then Paul saw Jesus, the vision on the road to Damascus and all. I don't know what went on in his mind, but in reading his writings, I get an impression that Paul, from the time that he became a Christian until the time that he died, Paul was a man of tremendous gratitude. He was so grateful to the Lord for dying for him. And so he said, in the Roman letter, he said, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And then he says, would someone die for a just person? Here's a person who obeys all the laws. Would someone die for a person, he may be a scoundrel, but he obeys the laws? And Paul's answer is, his implied answer, you don't find people who will die for folks like that. Once in a while, you may find somebody who would give his life for someone else who was a very righteous and very merciful person. You might find someone like that. And then he says, but while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, the gratitude that Paul expresses in this, I think, was a big key to the successful life of Paul. And so Paul says in the Philippian letter, he says, in nothing be anxious, but in all things, by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will guard your hearts and your lives in Christ Jesus. Well, let's look at a contrast here for a moment. In Proverbs chapter 26, verse 21, as charcoal to embers and as wood to fire, so is the quarrelsome man for kindling strife. Isn't that something? Have you ever been out camping somewhere or something like that, or maybe at the fireplace in your home before we had gas logs and all? You'd be burning wood, and it'd just gradually burn away, and that was the end of it. But if you keep putting wood on the fire, it just keeps burning. And so the writer of Proverbs there is just saying, quarrelsome people feed the fire of division, feed the fire of dissension, just like wood feeds the fire that we have at a campsite. Another statement that Paul makes, Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each one should look not to the things of himself, but also to the interest of others. That's hard to do, folks. Someone wrote a book, I mentioned to you a number of times, a crazy book. I read the thing. Somebody said, you ought to read this book. It was entitled Looking Out for Number One. Well, it was a terrible book. It was an awful book. It centered entirely, 100%, on I'll get mine, nuts to you. This was the idea. Well, Paul says, don't look at your own interests. Look at the interests of others. What a wonderful statement to make in reference to families, in reference to communities, in reference to my own personal good, to look to the good of other people. An unselfish spirit helps us overcome the bad habits, and that's something that brings peace to us. Well, the early Christian congregations were small. Our congregation right here, 25, 35 people or so, we would be considered probably an above average congregation in the early or very early days of the church. But Paul told them in Ephesians 4:2, he says, walk worthily of your calling wherewith you were called, with all lowliness and meekness and long suffering, forbearing one another in love. Just notice how many good things he talks about that we need to learn to practice. What will this bring to us? Well, it'll bring all sorts of things, but one of the things that I'm talking about tonight is it brings peace personally to us. A feeling of tranquility, because I am developing into a person like God, as God wants me to be. Well, these early Christian congregations, boy, they had a hard time. For the most part, they were poor. There were a lot of slaves in the very early church, according to the second century writers. There were a lot of poor people in the church. The church didn't have a lot of money to spend and things like this. But because they were so dedicated because they were so grateful for what God had done in their lives. They lived that way, so that they were in stark contrast to the rest of the people around them. And this is kind of disappointing in a way, I guess. In a few hundred years, the church, Christianity, had permeated the Roman Empire in such a way that Christians could be found all over the Roman Empire. And although we don't think about this very much, Christianity spread all the way into China in the 2nd century. We don't hear very much about that. Why did it do that? Because these people found something in Christ that completely revolutionized their lives. And so I think in terms of this as something where when we live in peace, when we're at peace with ourselves and at peace with God, when we live that way, it's so much easier to live at peace with other people. And that's the lesson that the entire world needs to know. Let us then be encouraged not to blend into the culture that's around us, but to be lights that are shining in a dark place.